Tánaiste, in a recent interview with Neil Prendeville on immigration, you repeatedly cited the need to show humanity when dealing with asylum claims.
61% of those coming into the country have no documentation, and they're an immediate cost to the state. They're coming from countries that would be regarded as quite safe. And people are very, very worried or angry or annoyed that that kind of money is being spent when it could have been spent helping Irish people if you had the will to do it before the war in the Ukraine.
Well, what would you do?
What would I do?
No, so I
would close the borders.
That's shocking.
Why?
Have you any humanity?
I mean, no, it's not about that. It's about people saying at this stage that we cannot do any more.
Neil, what I'm trying to say to you is we have to have some degree of humanity.
No, Leo Varadkar has said that we should pretty much stop and send money instead.
Sorry, I think in the immediate aftermath of that war, people had to leave certain localities because of the brutality of the war.
Yeah,
I went to Busha. What are you talking about? I mean, the point is, I'm not going to. We're having a robust debate here, but I'm not going to sit and take narratives.
But you know that thousands of asylum seekers have illegally entered the state without documents in the past year, which is, of course, an offence under the 2004 Immigration Act. And Taoiseach Leo Varadkar has already admitted that some people are allowed to stay in the country even after they have their request for refugee status refused. The Department of Justice has admitted that there are people whose claims are rejected and then they're allowed to stay in the state. So is that not making a joke of Irish immigration law and border control?
No, it doesn't, because it does depend on different circumstances. So sometimes people will have their application for refugee status refused, but they will be granted leave to remain on humanitarian grounds.
So is it not a bit misleading to frame this as showing humanity to people fleeing war when we know for a fact that at least some of the people coming in are simply opportunistic economic migrants who are taking advantage of the system, at least in some cases?
Well, actually, if I recollect, the term humanity was in the context of a question in relation to Ukrainians coming in. And
he said close the borders.
I did the interview, okay, and he did reference other issues in terms of asylum seeking. I asked a question in respect of Ukrainians fleeing war. I think it is about humanity. I basically do. And I think the vast majority of Ukrainians who have come into this country, particularly in the aftermath of the war, were fleeing the deliberate bombing of infrastructure, the deliberate bombing of energy, of the residential blocks. And we can forget as war goes on and we can get war fatigue. But I was in the train station in Kyiv. I saw the exhibition, which reminded me of what the scenes were like at the time when the Russian bombs were landing. And can you remember the trains packed of fathers saying goodbye to their kids as they were piled onto trains to get out? And that was the scene. So I do react against the attempt to characterize this in the kind of narrative that did emerge in that interview, and I responded robustly about it. Now, in terms of asylum seeking more generally, the government takes steps at airports and so on, and with airlines, in respect of anybody who's trying to abuse the system. But if a person lands in Ireland under international law, under the Geneva Convention, they can apply for asylum, and we have to deal with the application and make a judgment as to whether a person is an economic migrant or is genuinely in need of asylum. And that can be a process which very often ends up in the judicial process. But we have international obligations. As a country, we're very strong globally at all international fora in promoting human rights, respect for humanity, and dignity of every individual person. I made a point during the interview, and it's very difficult when it's always reduced to a certain phraseology. Migration is a global phenomenon, principally caused by conflict, wars, appalling authoritarian governance, and irrespective of all the walls that certain people might want to build, or the idea that this very simplistic notion that we have an open border, which is this phrase I just think is overly simplistic and doesn't capture the accuracy of this. The bottom line is, as the military advisor to the UN Secretary General said to me recently when he visited Ireland, if you live in Eritrea, if you live in the Sahel, and you're a young person, you know what? Your life is so miserable, your life is so sort of ordained for you, that you'll do anything to get out and get somewhere else. And in many respects, many have ended up in warehouses in Libya in the most appalling of conditions. So the point is then that what we need to do is to fund more, I think, good governance in countries across the world through our international development aid program. We need to consistently work on climate and on conflict, reduce conflict, try and create better conditions so that people don't see the need to migrate. Because all over the world there's migration on unprecedented levels. Spoke to Lebanon minister this morning. There's 1.5 million Syrians in Lebanon. I was in Jordan last month. There's 2.5 million Palestinians and 1.3 million Syrians, all fleeing horrible war in Syria. And only for Ireland on the Security Council, we retained and maintained the humanitarian corridor to Syria. We did the same in Ethiopia. So all I'd appeal really would be for a more rounded overall perspective on this. It is creating pressures on us. Of that there is no doubt. But there is no sort of magic wand or sort of simplistic narrative that you can reduce this to. We saw this in Britain. Brexit happened because of this sort of narrative on migration. And then you had the idea that we'll send everybody to Rwanda. That didn't last too long in terms of its effectiveness or impact. And above all, and it's difficult, and there's all sorts of pressures, being a country where after the famine, millions fled Ireland and were taken in elsewhere. Of all countries, we should always have as our primary concern the dignity of the human being and of the individual, irrespective of the circumstances in the background. That creates huge challenges for us. That is my position on it.
But sorry, Tánaiste, I'm just looking at the. I just.
Kesh, don't.